A head coach disappears in the middle of an international tournament. No announcement, no press release, no explanation, just gone. And the moment she stops making decisions, the player she had been quietly limiting for 2 games walks onto the floor as a starter and proceeds to help dismantle the opposition by 55 points, 101-46. That is not a coincidence. That is a confession. And now that Nate Tibbetts has accidentally given us the most revealing coaching comparison in recent women's basketball history, the questions are no longer theoretical. They are documented, time-stamped, and sitting on a very uncomfortable table. Because what happened during Team USA's FIBA Americas qualifying run did not just settle a debate about Caitlin Clark's role on the national team. It cracked open a much bigger story about who has been making decisions, what those decisions were protecting, and what it costs a team every single time someone decides that keeping Clark controlled is worth more than letting her win. If the pattern we are about to break down has you seeing the WNBA landscape differently, hit that like button right now. Because what happened in Puerto Rico did not stay in Puerto Rico. And by the time this is done, you are going to understand exactly why Stephanie White should be paying very close attention to everything that just unfolded on that international stage. Let us go back to the beginning of this qualifying run, because the foundation of this story starts with what Clark did before anyone had a chance to limit her. Against Italy, in her first game on the international stage at this level, Caitlin Clark did not ease in. She did not spend the first half finding her rhythm or adjusting to international spacing like the analysts love to project onto her every time she enters a new environment. She immediately rewrote the record book. 5 records, 1 game, 1 stat sheet, 5 separate entries into the history of Team USA international basketball, each one representing a bar that had stood for years and was erased within the span of a single appearance. That is not an adjusted player. That is a player who arrived with something to prove and then proved it before the conversation could even begin. The performance was loud enough that any reasonable coaching staff in any sport, at any level, would have looked at that output and made an immediate structural decision. This is the engine now. Build around it. Let it run. What followed instead was something that can only be described as an aggressive attempt to manage a player who had just made it impossible to argue against her. Lawson began shifting rotations. Minutes became inconsistent. The player who had just broken 5 international records in 1 appearance started finding herself off the ball, standing in spaces that felt less like positioning and more like containment. Chelsea Gray, a decorated veteran and respected player in her own right, retained starting duties across multiple games, while Clark entered off the bench or operated in a reduced role that bore no visible relationship to what she had just produced on the scoreboard. Fans noticed, and fans in this era are not passive observers waiting to be told how to interpret what they are watching. They are analysts with film access. They rewatch clips at half speed, and they are exceptionally good at identifying when something feels engineered rather than organic. The visual evidence was right there. Clark wide open, ball going elsewhere. Clark initiating the offense, only for the pace to immediately throttle back the moment the possession shifted. A Team USA offense that looked electric in flashes and strangely hesitant in the stretches where she was not the primary decision-maker. At a press conference, a reporter asked a direct and completely reasonable question about Clark's role. What came back was a masterclass in non-answers. Lawson drifted into territory about shared responsibility, about every player being a star in her own system, about how a roster this talented requires everyone to stay engaged, all of which is technically accurate and completely beside the point. Nobody on the floor or in the stands was confused about whether the roster had talent. The confusion was specifically about why the player who just produced 5 historical benchmarks in a single game was being asked to operate like one piece among equals, rather than the obvious hub of what this team was capable of becoming. And here is where the story stops being about rotation philosophy and starts being about something that looks a lot more deliberate, because also embedded in that coaching staff, Connected to Lawson's broader ecosystem was Stephanie White, the same Stephanie White who coaches Clark every day with the Indiana Fever. And if you have been watching the Fever closely over the past season, certain patterns start to feel familiar. Slow the game down. Move Clark off the primary decision-making role. Introduce structure that distributes responsibility more evenly. On paper, it reads as a philosophical approach to team basketball, side by side with what was happening in Puerto Rico. It starts to look like a shared methodology, one that prioritizes managed balance over the unleashed output that Clark actually produces when given the wheel. Now the question is whether that methodology was a strategic error or something more intentional. And here is where the footage from inside the Team USA experience becomes part of the story. Because alongside the game tape, people had been paying attention to how Clark was carrying herself throughout the tournament. Not loud, not visibly frustrated, not the kind of player who communicates displeasure through body language designed for slow-motion reaction edits. She kept her head down. She stayed serious. She went to work in whatever capacity the coaching staff made available to her and produced within those limits, while the people around her moved and celebrated in the downtime between games. That contrast, the isolation, in a room full of teammates who are laughing and loosened up, tells you something about how a competitor processes a situation where she knows she is capable of more but is not being given the space to do it. She never complained publicly, no cryptic posts, no loaded interviews, no passive-aggressive quotes that could be read two ways depending on your interpretation. Just a player with her head down, doing the work, waiting. And that restraint ended up being the most devastating possible response to the limitations placed around her, because it forced everyone else to do the explaining while she simply kept producing every time she stepped on the floor. And then Kara Lawson disappeared. No announcement, no gradual transition, no official explanation attached to a timeline that anyone could follow. One day, Kara Lawson was managing rotations and deflecting questions at press conferences. The next day, she was not on the sideline, not phased out, not ceremonially replaced in a structured handover, just absent, with Nate Tibbetts stepping into the gap and inheriting a roster that had spent 2 games operating under a philosophical framework that had produced uneven results and a growing cloud of suspicion. Drop your take in the comments right now. Do you think Lawson's departure was timing, or do you think someone made a decision? Because the way this played out, the silence around it, the speed of the turnaround that followed, it does not feel random. And the community has been putting the pieces together in real time, so I want to know what you are seeing. What Tibbetts did next was so simple, it almost looked radical by comparison. He looked at his roster, identified his best player, and gave her the starting position. That was it. No committee deliberation. No philosophical speech about distributing responsibility across the group. No attempt to engineer a version of Caitlin Clark that fit inside a pre-existing system. He started the best player and trusted the architecture to build itself around that decision. And the architecture responded immediately. The offense began to flow. Players who had looked slightly stiff and hesitant in earlier possessions suddenly found their rhythm. The spacing opened up. The pace became something defenses had to genuinely prepare for rather than something they could manage at a comfortable speed. And the names surrounding Clark in that lineup, Kelsey Plum, Paige Beckers, Angel Reese, the full configuration of what this roster was actually capable of, suddenly started functioning like a team that understood its own blueprint. The 55-point blowout, 101-46, was not just a scoreboard result, it was a demonstration. A before and after comparison delivered in real time for an international audience that had been watching the before version play out over 2 previous games. And then Tibbetts walked to the podium. And he did not do the thing coaches typically do after a controversial situation gets resolved through dramatic turnaround. He did not credit the previous approach. He did not offer diplomatic language about how the earlier struggles were a natural part of tournament adjustment. He said in plain terms that the constant rotation changes had not worked, that the group needed consistency, that the lineup anchored by Clark made sense. in coaching language in the specific dialect coaches use to avoid accountability in press settings. What Tibbetts said was as close as you get to, yes, we overcomplicated something that was always obvious, and someone just stopped us from continuing to overcomplicate it. Before we go further, if this kind of investigation, breaking down the decisions happening beneath the surface of WNBA and USA basketball coverage, is why you keep coming back, consider joining the channel as a member. Your support is what makes it possible to keep digging into the stories nobody else is framing this clearly. What Tibbetts' post-game statement did, perhaps unintentionally, was turn this entire situation into a documented case study, not a rumor, not fan speculation, not a reaction video reading body language at half speed. A coach confirming on record that the prior approach was flawed, that stability matters, and that the version of this team that produced a dominant international performance was built on the straightforward principle of deploying your best player in the role she was born to occupy. That statement now lives permanently in the record. And it has a direct impact on a conversation happening much closer to home, because Stephanie White runs the Indiana Fever. And the Indiana Fever are Caitlin Clark's professional team. And the philosophy that Tibbetts just publicly invalidated is a recognizable cousin of the approach White has been applying at the WNBA level, where the Fever's offensive structure has not always prioritized Clark as the absolute hub of every possession, the way her output would seem to demand. Share this video with one person who has been following the Team USA situation, because what we are about to get into is the part that directly shapes the upcoming WNBA season in ways that fans are only starting to process. The parallel is not subtle, and it is not accidental. Slow the game down, distribute the responsibility, make sure everyone stays involved. On paper, this sounds like good coaching. In practice, when you apply it to a player who changes the entire pace and efficiency of a team by simply having the ball in her hands, it produces the awkward stretches and stalled possessions that Team USA fans watched in the early qualifying games and that Fever fans have watched during stretches of the regular season. The uncomfortable truth that the Puerto Rico tournament has now made impossible to ignore is that both versions of this story played out simultaneously, in front of an international audience, and only one of them produced a 55-point statement. Only one of them ended with the coach acknowledging that the system finally worked. That contrast is now public evidence. It is not a theory being argued in fan forums. It is a documented comparison of two approaches applied to the exact same player, producing drastically different outcomes, confirmed by the coaching staff directly responsible for the positive result. And that documentation is going to follow Stephanie White into training camp, into the regular season opener, and into every rotation decision she makes once the Fever step back onto the court. Because fans are no longer watching with hope. They are watching with receipts. They have seen the version where Clark is not just participating, but orchestrating, where the tempo is relentless, where defenses are not just reacting, but panicking, where teammates who are talented in their own right suddenly look elevated rather than balanced. That version is now the baseline expectation, not the aspirational outcome. And the moment the Fever's offense reverts to something that looks slower, something more controlled, something that treats Clark as one important piece in a distributed system rather than the engine that powers the entire machine, it is not going to land quietly. The audience has seen the alternative. They know what it looks like. And back in Puerto Rico, the mystery around Lawson's departure has not been resolved, which means the speculation has more room to grow with every day that passes without a clear explanation. Was it a scheduling conflict with Duke, where she coaches at the collegiate level? Was it an internal disagreement with USA Basketball about how the tournament was being managed? Was it something completely unrelated that collided with the most controversial rotation decisions of the qualifying run? Nobody has given a definitive answer. And in the absence of answers, the timing does the work on its own. Because the replacement coach arrived, made one obvious structural change, and produced the most dominant performance of the entire tournament within hours of taking over. That is the kind of sequence that does not get forgotten. The moment someone stopped trying to limit Caitlin Clark, everything started working again. The question that now hangs over both USA Basketball and the Indiana Fever is not complicated. It is not nuanced. It is not the kind of question that can be answered with philosophical frameworks about team balance or stylistic preferences or the unique challenges of managing a roster full of stars. The question is simply this: if unleashing Caitlin Clark was always the obvious answer, what exactly was the point of everything that came before? That question now has receipts. It has a scoreboard. It has a coach confirming it on record. And it has an entire fan base that has already done the math and is waiting to see if the people making decisions finally do the same. If you want to be here for the next chapter of this story, subscribe and turn on notifications right now. Because when the Fever season opens and those first rotation decisions get made, we are going to be the first ones back in here with the analysis. And trust me, based on everything we just watched play out on an international stage, that conversation is going to be one you do not want to miss.